Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast. Today's conversation series episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, this is the site that's got it all. Visit thecollector.com. Stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Today on History Shorts. In an era where historical figures are increasingly scrutinized through the lens of colonialism, identity, and cultural memory, few evoke as much controversy as Christopher Columbus. Joining us today is acclaimed historian and author Matthew Restall, whose latest book, The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus, masterfully unravels the myths, reinventions, and enduring legacies of the Genoese explorer who forever altered the course of world history. From his transformation into an American icon to his vilification as a symbol of genocide and plunder, Restall's work challenges us to confront the fluid nature of historical narratives. In this interview, we'll delve into the surprising lives that have kept Columbus alive in public discourse for over 5 centuries.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Matt, welcome to History Shorts.
Thank you. Happy to be on it.
So the book's structure, organizing Columbus into these 9 distinct lives, is very unusual. What was the inspiration for this structure and this research?
The 9 lives, obviously it's a feline metaphor, right? But it doesn't mean that Columbus cheated death 8 times during his actual lifetime. So I'm not using the metaphor absolutely literally. What it refers to is how many Columbuses have been created and kept alive across the centuries. And the title came to me, actually, there's 2 sort of origins of the book. And one is the fact that I've been teaching subjects related to Columbus for 30 years. In fact, I got my PhD in the year of the quincentennial in 1992, when there was a lot of work coming out in the 90s about Columbus, and then he just kind of, faded from view. But, I've been reading about him, kind of fascinated by the controversies or the controversies that surround him that periodically come up in October every year. So there's kind of a deep root to the book in that sense. Without kind of realizing it, I've sort of been working on this book for decades. But if you had said to me at any point before about 3 years ago, would you write an entire book on Columbus? I'd say no. There's 2,000 books on Columbus. There's more books on Columbus than on anybody else in the history of the Americas outside the US. And even then, if we put in like JFK and Lincoln and so on, Columbus is still like in the top 5, right? So it's crazy. Why would you write another book? Because there was no angle. I didn't see any kind of an angle. Well, 3 years ago, I'm in the Spanish province of Galicia, or Galicia, visiting friends, and they say, we want you to meet our neighbors. Oh yeah, meet the neighbors. What are you doing? This. I tell this story at the beginning of the book, right? Because it's important. It's this great eureka moment. I tell them the kind of stuff I write about, including Spanish Empire, and they said, "Oh, no wonder you're here." What do you mean? I said, "Well, because this is where he's from. Who? The guy who started the whole thing, Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon." I go, "You mean the Genoese sailor from Genoa in Italy?" No. He wasn't really from Genoa. That's just what the Italians say. They would say that. They're Italians. No. He's from here. His name was really Pedro Madruga de Sotomayor. He was a Galician nobleman. We can take you to his castle. He didn't really die in 1492. He just changed his name and then crossed the ocean. They took me to the castle. Right there, it's presented to all the visitors, right, that this guy was really Christopher Columbus. It just blew my mind. And I realized all along, I was kind of waiting for some kind of moment of inspiration, some story that cracked open the subject of Christopher Columbus in a totally different way. And this was it. I thought, this is a totally different Columbus. This is another Columbus avatar or manifestation. And then the title just came to me. It's like 9 Lives. It just came to me, and I thought it was such a good title. I must have stolen it from somebody else. So I was texting all my friends in the business, like, have you ever heard of a book called The 7 Lives? People like who know documentary films. Is there a documentary called this? Is there a pop song? I'm like searching on like Spotify. I mean, I'm convinced that the title is already out there in the universe. And when I realized it wasn't, that kind of inspired me even more to write the book. It's such a good title. I got to put a book to back it up, right? And then came the fun of, kind of figuring out how to slice that pizza into 9 slices, right? I'm lucky there's 9, because in Spanish, a cat only has 7 lives. In Arabic, only 6 lives. So luckily I'm writing in English, because it wasn't so hard to have to find 9 of them.
So can you just briefly list or describe what are these 9 slices, and perhaps what is the advantage of conveying this man's historical complexity by breaking it down into these slices? I like the way you said slices. Sorry.
The slices. Yeah, well, you're from New Jersey, so you're gonna like the
Yes.
pizza slice. That's elemental to your culture, right? And I mean that in a really good way.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through all of the lives, because I want somebody listening to go, I want to know what that other life is. I'm going to buy the book.
Yeah.
But only I'll tell you this: only the first 2 are fully biographical, meaning they are the lives that he had historically between his birth and death. The first life is what I call his ordinary life. First 40 years of his life, where he's not really anybody at all. He's just a Genoese sailor like any other, trying to make his way in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. He's not anybody who we would ever have heard of if that was into his entire life, right? And then the second life, too, is his extraordinary life from 1492 until he dies 14 years later. That's kind of the transformation for him, and he becomes a kind of a different person. And then the subsequent lives are mostly posthumous lives. There's one called The Lover. They all have titles like that, right? The first one is the Genoese. That's who he is at the beginning. The second one is the Admiral, because that great title that he gets, that is the title that means so much to him, is the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, meaning the Admiral of the Atlantic Ocean, right? There's one called The Lover, which does delve back into his historic life, but it's also as much about subsequent attempts all the way up into the present day to romanticize him. And then there's another chapter on his remains, like his titles and his bones and what happens to them and the battles over them. It's like absolutely fascinating stuff for me. I thought, I should mention the fact that 2 different cities claim they have his bones. But once I got into researching the story and how that happened, I thought, no, there's a good half chapter here. This is a totally fascinating, wacky story that, like so many things in here, it's like, this is the book that answers all the questions you had about Christopher Columbus, and much better, all the questions you never knew you had. Like, wait, how many different places are claiming they have him? And there's an urn of ashes in Genoa. Was he cremated? No, he wasn't. What? Well, how does that come about? How does, that's in there, right? And then let me kind of jump to the end of the last 2 lives. I think are particularly interesting to American readers, because they are the American Columbuses, or rather, life 8 is the Adam, and that's the American Columbus, the patriotic icon. That's the Columbus that Americans who are not necessarily Italian Americans, that's the one they're defending or attacking usually. The last one, the 9th life, is the Italian American Columbus, and those are different. There's 2 different Columbuses there, and they're very easy to confuse. Before I did the research on the book, I didn't fully understand the kind of the histories of how they came about and how different they are. But that's really important to understanding why people are still fighting over him all these years later, right? 520 years ago, he died. We're still fighting over him. What the heck? That's a great question right there. Like, why? Why are we still doing that? Well, and I'm trying to answer that here in a way, going all the way back to, you said, talk about the title. The title is kind of the answer to that question, because we're not really fighting about the Columbus of Life 1 and 2. We're actually fighting over all of these 9 Columbuses, particularly the Columbuses that are like Life 8 and 9.
And it's also, I felt like reading a book. It's like a Mythbusters episode, because there's a lot of things in here where you almost set us and the readers on the right path. Like, you thought this, but actually it's this. I mean, just the sheer fact that if you showed me a painting or a picture or a statue, I would be like, that's Columbus. And I did not know this. I have advanced degrees in history. I did not notice until your book that we actually have no clue what Columbus looked like.
I know. I love that. And you see, Peter, this was the fun of writing the book, because, I didn't know everything about Columbus before I wrote the book, right? I thought I knew a lot, and I had read a lot of books and documents and so on, but it's just not the same as when you actually like dig down to write something like this. And I thought, I bet most of these images of Columbus are wrong. After all, they all look different, right? There's almost no common thread. I mean, there kind of is a little bit, but I thought, I wonder which one is the most authentic. Was there one done from life? I wondered, or maybe there was one. Let me see, all these claims of people saying, well, this wasn't done from life, but it was copied from an original that was done from life that is long lost. So I just, I tried to approach all the topics within this larger topic with an open mind. And I very quickly came to the conclusion that there was no image of him done from life. None of the ones that are out there are copies of ones that were done from life. It's all imagination and invention. And that's why, you're thinking of the picture at the Met, which is labeled, and the Met in New Jersey, you know what the Met is, but not everybody will know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. What an amazing museum. And they have this great painting by a Venetian artist called Sebastiano del Piombo, 16th century Venetian painter. And it says, said to be Christopher Columbus, which is a great little hedging. But it used to say Christopher Columbus because it actually says on the painting, this is Christopher Columbus. And some years ago, some brilliant art historians figured out, no, it's a painting of a clergyman from Bologna, painted about 30 years after Christopher Columbus died, has no connection to Columbus whatsoever. Later in the 16th century, maybe at the turn of the 17th century, somebody added the label Christopher Columbus, because then the painting's suddenly worth something. I mean, it's like if you took a painting of your grandmother, who I'm sure was a lovely woman, but maybe not so famous, and then you just put Eleanor Roosevelt and then signed it with it might be worth more money.
Yeah.
Right?
I love the fact that there's that small print. The man believed to be.
That's right. Believed to be. And that is so symbolic of this sort of topic, the larger topic of Columbiana, right? What I call Columbiana is the whole kind of books and discussion and so on surrounding Columbus, that it's said to be Columbus. And then let's argue about it. Everything. Columbus is a battleground. And I like to think that battleground can be turned into kind of a meeting point for debate and discussion. So it's a little bit more friendly than the image of a battleground.
Which one of these lives do you think is probably the one that's least argued over? And which one of these lives do you think would be the most controversial in today's modern history retelling of Columbus's story?
Yeah. That's an interesting way of thinking about the lives there. The least controversial one, probably the least controversial one, is maybe the one about his bones and his titles, because there's a good pair of stories there, right? And sure, that's controversial if you are fervently in the Spanish camp, saying no, we've got the bones here in Seville, and there are people that they opened up that tomb. They've been doing DNA tests on the bones to try to prove, first of all, that it really was Columbus, up against the claims in the Dominican Republic, where outside on the edges of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, there's a massive, massive tomb, huge building. It's like the size of 3 or 4 apartment buildings put together, with a big mausoleum inside. So it started out as that, but then they kind of caught one of the bugs in Spain about Columbus. That's a whole other life and a whole other chapter. But the idea that he's secretly a Jewish Spaniard. So they've been doing those tests. So yeah, for Spaniards, maybe there's some controversy there, but there's no way that I could know whether the bones in Seville or the bones in the Dominican Republic are the real ones. Like, as a historian investigating the paperwork, um, and the documents and so on, it wasn't totally clear to me. And I did not shy away from having an opinion, right? I'm not coming at this project from a partisan point of view in that I'm trying to prove that, he was Jewish or that he was a holy hero. It isn't like about me saying I'm defending Columbus or destroying Columbus or attacking him. I'm trying to explain everybody's kind of viewpoints. But I think it's also boring if I don't have an opinion to share with the reader based on my reading of the evidence, right? I think probably the likelihood is it's more likely that he's in Seville. But I think also his bones and the bones of his the other family members who were buried there, it's his brother, son, grandson, maybe another brother, I think they got muddled up. I think it's perfectly possible that both cities have at least one bone. And we're not talking about whole skeletons here. We're talking about like a little pile of bones, right? And a skull. I think it's possible that both cities have at least one piece of what was Columbus. And so my proposal is, can we just agree that everybody has a piece? There's enough to go around, right?
Wow.
And that's kind of the end of. So I think that's probably, there's controversy there, but probably the least controversy. The other part of that chapter is about the battle for his titles. And so I'll ask you if you knew this, because this amazed me. From the moment of Columbus's death, from the year he died, all the way into the 20th century, for 400 years, there were lawsuits among Columbus's descendants and between his descendants and the Spanish government. 400 years. And sometimes these lawsuits were all going on at the same time. There'd be a settlement, a break, and then just a matter of a few years before they start back up again. Lawsuits over the particularly the income, the revenue, the political positions gradually get kind of negotiated away. But the income, that sort of yearly stipend continues to be paid. As far as I can tell, it's still being paid. And the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea is held today by the 20th Admiral of the Ocean Sea, whose name is Don Cristobal Colon. He's a direct descendant. This was just like a mind-boggling little piece of information here that you don't have to read my book to find out about that. If you kind of dug around, you could piece that together, this book and that book, and it's like you could read some Wikipedia pages and so on. But what I wanted to do was package that story so it's like short, readable, and connects to the larger story, right? That's kind of the connecting of the dots. That's what's important. You wanted to know what was the least controversial. I think that chapter is a fun read, and I don't think it's quite as controversial. What would be the most controversial one? I think probably the American Columbus, because he's created in the 19th century to represent the United States as it sees itself in the 19th century, particularly those who are in charge of the country, the political elite in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill. That's their vision of what this country is then. And it's a vision that very much excludes people who came in as enslaved Africans and their descendants. It excludes indigenous peoples who were already there. In fact, that's slightly different. It doesn't exclude them. It includes them as very much a kind of foil to Columbus as a symbol of civilization. So a lot of this imagery, the paintings, statues, and so on, and there's Columbus images all over the Capitol building in the US, right? And there used to be more, particularly statues outside, have indigenous culture is symbolized by a kind of a half-naked, cowering, native woman. I mean, that imagery, which was offensive to native peoples and those that sympathized with them, even in the 19th century, and just became increasingly offensive in the 20th century. So here you've got a Columbus that very much reflects a certain kind of America that was absolutely predominant in the 19th century. It's the America of, removal of indigenous peoples. It's the America that only abolishes slavery throughout the entire country after a civil war. It's the America that invades and takes half of Mexico. This is, let's say, a robust United States, right? It's a rapidly expanding, growing United States. And its population is the increase in population in the 19th century is absolutely staggering. And it's achieved mostly through the acquisition of new territory by conquest and through immigration. But the Christopher Columbus that is invented to symbolize this nation is not a Statue of Liberty figure saying, bring your immigrants, come on in. It's more like, I did this hundreds of years ago, and I'm the grandfather of the nation. And then George Washington is the father of the nation. And these are the people who built the nation. And anybody else who wants to come in, we may not let you. And if we do, these are the circumstances under which we're going to let you in. So I think that's a controversial kind of invented Columbus, even at the time. And now in the 21st century, he's even more controversial because he doesn't, either you could say he simply doesn't fit America in the 21st century, or he doesn't fit enough Americans in the 21st century. So he becomes kind of a magnet for pretty much any hot button issue in America today that relates to, identity and how we feel about ourselves and our country. And isn't that kind of the situation we're in right now? I mean, I'm not a politician or a pundit, so I can't say anything wise about politics or the current situation, except to say that, I understand historically why Columbus is kind of a touch point, and that people can gather around a Columbus monument, say next week, or in October, in any given year, and they're going to fight about Columbus, but what they're really fighting about is America. 250 years of American history. They're not fighting about the 15th century. They're fighting about the country that, has been created and what direction should it go in and who should decide that and what the identity of, like huge, huge stuff. So I like that. That's great.
Yeah.
As long as people aren't committing acts of violence, if we're all talking about this stuff, then that's good.
It's this idea of myth making at the mid 1800s. That's also when you start getting these ideas of Paul Revere. Paul Revere's Ride becomes a famous poem. It seems like it's this nationalism that's rising after the War of 1812 through, Manifest Destiny. And the United States is looking for heroes. It looks to its past and puts certain people on pedestal, not by kind of painting, definitely embellished in a sense, right? History around him. And Columbus is one of those people. He becomes a pantheon of American history. This shift towards not liking Columbus. Do you remember the book Lies My Teacher Told Me?
Yes.
I was going through college and learning about Columbus. He was still the Columbus. And then that book came out. And I feel like that book made its way to a lot of classrooms, and a lot of teachers teaching in high school started to propagate this idea of, well, he was also bad because A, B, C, D. In light of all the recent controversies, removal of Columbus statues and changing Columbus Day's name, do you think that there will be a time or reversal, or maybe a time where he was not going to be a polarizing figure? And perhaps by breaking him down into these 9 different lives, do you think that might help people see him as less polarizing?
I hope so. And the short answer is yes, I think there's a potential there for people to understand when they're fighting about Christopher Columbus, for them to realize that they are each defending and then attacking or attacking a different Columbus. And so once you can accept that, it's like, no, that's your Columbus. My Columbus is different. Okay, who is your Columbus and why? And that was one of the parts of the book I found most surprising and enjoyable in writing, was about Italian Americans and their history and the history of migration. That absolutely fascinated me. Again, I thought I knew about it, and it wasn't until I kind of got deep into that literature I realized, how powerful that wave of immigrants was and how much discrimination they faced, and the mechanisms that they sought to become assimilated and to become to go from being Italians to being Italian Americans to being Americans of Italian descent, right? Those kind of stages and the role that Columbus played in that. And that really helped me to understand why Italian Americans are so indignant and kind of hurt when they see their Columbus statues, beheaded and splattered in red paint and pulled down and so on. They take it really personally. And of course, we all kind of understand why they do that, but I didn't really get it until I did this research to show how that Columbus for them represents their, let's say, grandparents or great-grandparents, who also came from Italy on a boat and crossed the Atlantic, not sure where they were going, in order to make better lives for themselves. So when you think of it that way, and just for the sake of understanding, like, cut out all the historic stuff, right? Cut out the fact that that there were indigenous peoples involved in this story right from the get-go. Just kind of don't think about that from the point of view of Italian Americans. It really helped me to see that, yes, that would be so upsetting, because he's not really the historic Christopher Columbus. He's like a great grandfather. That's what they're seeing. And in the really Italian American Columbus monuments, like the one in Columbus Circle in New York City, that I picked that to write about because it seemed to me one of the more obviously Italian American ones. And you can kind of see that. Then you look at some of the ones that were not put up by Italian Americans, or are not in this, maybe paid for, but the architect and so on was different. Would be, say, Columbus in front of Union Station in Washington, D.C., that Columbus. That is about something very different. The imagery is really different. And this project kind of opened my eyes to that. So I hope that people who are concerned about this and are like, whether you're like, no, it should still be Columbus Day, no, change it to Indigenous Peoples Day, that my book helps them to see that there are different viewpoints and that maybe we're arguing at cross purposes and that there can be kind of some common grounds. Now, what does that mean in terms of the monuments? Then that has to be a community by community, monument by monument kind of decision. I think a monument that has sort of very 19th century images of indigenous peoples as savages, barely dressed, cowering, afraid, the kind of very negative stereotypes, in a place, in a community where there's a strong indigenous presence, that statue probably should not still be there, right? I mean, I don't like to see things, just historic things. As a historian, I hate to think of anything being destroyed that's historic. I'd hate to see those statues, ground down and destroyed. But I'm just speaking as a historian, not as someone who's defending all the Columbus statues. So I would like to see them moved. I think in Chicago, there's one. I don't know how far it was moved. There's so many, and I couldn't keep track of all of them when I was doing the research. But they're essentially building a museum around this statue, and it's all supported by the Italian American community. It's basically a museum to Italian American migration and that story, and Columbus is in there. That seems like a good solution to me, right? And it's open to other people. You can come in. I mean, these things should be kind of teaching points. Someone asked me, well, what do you think about the one in New York City? That's a pretty prominent location. Should that still be there if it's, offensive to people's? Like, I hate to think of that Columbus being pulled down in Columbus Circle, but is it practical for me to argue that this is a teaching point and that people who march there and say this is a symbol of slavery, and we're the descendants of people who are enslaved, and that's really offensive? Like, that's an opinion that really needs to be respected. You can't just dismiss that and say, I'm sorry, but that's, Columbus was all about enslaving indigenous peoples, not peoples from Africa. So therefore, that's like a different subject. You can't do that, right? But what you can do is say, let's talk about why Columbus was involved in the slave trade. Is it because he was an especially bad person? Maybe, but only if that's the case, that's because everybody was bad. What do you mean everybody? Well, okay. We start getting into trouble to break it down, but slavery was everywhere in the world. It meant different things at different times. it would be really odd for Columbus not to have been involved in the slave trade as someone who was a merchant mariner in the 15th century. And so we don't have any direct evidence, for example, that on any of his voyages in the Atlantic in the 1470s and 80s that there were enslaved Africans on board, but it's pretty likely he did at some point go down the coast of Africa, and almost it would have been very odd if there weren't some captives on there who were being then taken to be sold in slave markets in Lisbon or in Seville. So yes, he's definitely a part of it, and you can't get around that. But what I would hope is instead of that being, see, Columbus is bad, or let's just keep talking about Columbus, instead, we use that as an opening into talking about the slave trade. What exactly happened here? How did this get so terrible? Okay, slavery is everywhere in the 15th century, but by the time we get on a couple of centuries, we've got a thing called the transatlantic slave trade, which is absolutely horrific. 10, 15 million, maybe more sub-Saharan Africans against their will shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to miserable lives of toil. And I mean, that's huge. We need to understand that and understand how that happened in order for something like that not to happen again. And so when we talk about that, that kind of does loop us back. You see, Columbus is a symbol of all of that. Well, he is and he isn't, right? And that's where I hope my 9 Lives framework allows people to kind of separate these things out without making kind of concessions, like having to say, well, okay, this slavery was bad, but this wasn't so bad, or something like that. Those are terrible, terrible positions and arguments and slippery slopes to go down, right?
It's always easier for us to judge historical figures from our point of view because it's all we know is our point of view. But I like the fact that, what your book does too. It zeroes in on something and then like a camera, it zooms out. Let's consider the context of this life. Let's consider the context of this issue. What are you working on next?
Well, I'm writing a book about the early history of Belize. And if you're thinking, oh, so you're going from a subject that everybody knows to a subject that nobody cares about, really, except people in Belize, probably the country that has been written least about of any country in the Americas. So the other end of the spectrum, this is a book I've been working on and off for decades. I find the early history of Belize absolutely fascinating. And I love busting myths. You said that this Columbus book is kind of a myth-busting book. And I discovered in working on the early history of Belize that I could not find any evidence of the early, almost a whole century of Belizean existence. It's Maya country. There were Maya peoples living there, but there's not so much the Spaniards, but the British. As modern Belize as a nation that was a British colony and a British Hondurasans descended from a British settlement, and I couldn't find any evidence of those early years. And I thought, oh, is this a myth that can be busted? And I found others as well. It's the origin mythology of Belize is absolutely fascinating from that point of view. So, in this Columbus book, obviously, there's all kinds of things I hope people take away from it about Columbus and to understand Columbus better. But also, I like the idea that it will stimulate discussion about history and myth history. And there's a word I invented in here. Sooner or later, someone's going to come along and say, you didn't invent it. I found it in a book from 50 years ago, whatever. But the word is faith history, where the H does double duty, right? It's one word, faith history. And it kind of goes with myth history. And so faith history, it's not about religion. It's about history that is based on a belief. So someone approaches a historical topic with a belief, which is so much a part of Columbiana. Like someone to say, I believe that Columbus was really Portuguese. And now I'm going to do all this work. And everything I do, I'm going to cut out evidence and put in evidence to help me make the argument that he was secretly a Jewish Portuguese spy working for the king and so on. There's a whole tradition of books making that claim going back 100 years, right, for example. And so I think that way of thinking about history as something that is organic and constantly changing, that our understanding of any past human being or any event is never set in stone. It's always shifting because our perspectives are always shifting. When you said we can only judge based on what we know, but what we know changes. Every day it changes. We, as individuals and as a culture, we have different views on what's happening in the world today. and in the past. So that's what draws me to the origin mythology of Belize. I'm hoping I can write a book that people who have no interest in Belize at all will say, well, I like the book because it got me thinking differently about my own country's origin mythology or my own family's origin mythology, or whatever it is. Thank you for asking about that. But we're really promoting The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. Available wherever books are sold, or what is the line?
Where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and what you're up to?
Try my website. So my website is simply my name, MatthewRestall.com. And there you'll find my other books, including I also have written books about popular music. I just had a book come out a few months ago on Elton John. Books take a different amount of time to write, right? And so they just, and to produce. So they happen to come out the same kind of year. But so I'm pitching. I just threw that in. You opened the door by asking me what I was working on and allowing me to talk about Belize. So I'm tossing Elton John in there as well.
Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time. This really was an amazing conversation.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on the show.
Hopefully, today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about the subject. For answers to questions, to leave a comment, or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook and X. Stay curious, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.